All 12 of these jurors, however, agreed, and apparently agreed faster than I and many others thought, that Trump is guilty. The reason that Donald Trump was convicted is not that Manhattan is a Democrat-leaning city, but because the evidence was sufficient to convince any reasonable juror, Republican or Democrat, that he's guilty.
Well, we're going to talk about this in some depth now. Let's first discuss it with Philip Lacovara, who is a former Deputy Solicitor General for the United States and counsel to the Watergate Special Prosecutor during the impeachment hearings of President Nixon. Philip, hello again.
Good evening, Henry. Nice to be with you.
Nice to be with you. You go back a long way. Can you put into context what this means from the legal point of view and a historic point of view for your country?
Well, it's a remarkable development that somebody who has been president and stands a reasonably good chance of becoming president again now stands convicted of 34 felony counts. A felony, as your listeners know, is a serious crime in the UK as well as in the United States. It's never been done before that anybody who's had this level of political notoriety and importance has faced the criminal process and now been found guilty. And yet he is likely to be he's certain to be the nominee of the Republican Party in July, and stands at least a 50% chance of becoming the president once again.
What do you make of the fact that the jury, after deliberating for 4 hours, then asked to hear the evidence and hear the instructions again, and came back after a total of what some say is pretty short, 9 hours, and they found Donald Trump guilty on all 34 counts unanimously?
I think that was shorter than many of us expected, simply because the number of counts normally would take special individual polling by the jurors. I think the handwriting was on the wall this morning, though, when they came back and asked the judge to repeat a couple of things. First, the testimony by the Mr. Pecker, the former publisher of a New York-based scandal magazine, who testified that he had specifically talked with President Trump about this program of catching and killing adverse news stories, and for the purpose of protecting Trump's political ambitions. And then the second ominous factor was the jury's request that the judge read back to them the instructions about how they could infer something from circumstantial evidence, how they might be able to find that Trump was involved in engaging in this program in order to bolster his political fortunes, even though there was no testimony other than Michael Cohen's that Trump was personally involved. And the fact that the judge reiterated that we make lots of decisions in our everyday lives on the basis of drawing conclusions from what we observe, and in this case, it's the classic story. Actually, this came up in a case that I tried in an impeachment of a governor, where the prosecution says, if you look out the window in the morning and you see the street is wet and you see people with carrying umbrellas and wearing raincoats, even if you didn't see it rain overnight, you might reasonably infer that it rained.
Yes.
That kind of example really hits home with people because it's such a practical insight. But what it means is, and this is how I got a governor acquitted, it means you can draw a conclusion which might very well be wrong. And the answer that I gave, the counter argument that I gave, which Trump's lawyer did not have the chance to give, was, well, if a street sweeping truck had come by while you were asleep and sprayed down the roadway with water, it might not have been rain that caused the street to be wet. So you might be drawing exactly the wrong inference if you concluded that it was that it had rained overnight. But the jury didn't hear that this kind of example can lead you to an erroneous conclusion as well as to one that might be accurate in most cases.
And Philip, talking of erroneous, President Trump said this was a perverse verdict, the system's rigged, the country's going to hell in a handcart, and his former lawyer, Alan Dershowitz, told me in the last hour that the jury got it badly wrong. I mean, this was the weakest of all the cases that Donald Trump faced, It shouldn't have been tried as a federal crime. It was a district attorney who shouldn't have brought it and converted it in this way. And he felt that all over the country we're going to see Republican prosecutors going after Democrats in an echo of what is clearly a political attack on Trump.
Alan, I think, has been hysterical on this subject for a number of years. He has, as we say, drunk the Kool-Aid of the Trump line of defense. I don't think it's realistic to think that Republican prosecutors around the country are going to be inventing crimes to prosecute Democrats for. Keep in mind that, as in this case, one has to get a grand jury to indict, then one has to get a trial jury to convict. I do not think that the fact that Donald Trump, who is facing several other serious federal and state charges, sets a new tone in the political landscape of the United States.
Be that as it may, Philip, what he said also, Alan Dershowitz, was, Trump had no chance of a fair trial. I mean, this is a Democrat-leaning city, 90% Democrat, and given all the publicity beforehand, and given the way in which the case was managed, Trump didn't have a chance, and rightly he's upset about it. And he said this, Dershowitz, even though he said, I'm going to vote for Biden. I don't think Trump is a great guy, but the law has to be fair, it has to be applied fairly, and this was not a fair trial.
Well, I think that argument is wildly overstated and unfounded. I just don't think it's fair, given the way the jury was selected in this case. There was an opportunity for both sides not only to strike jurors that they suspected might be biased, but actually to ask that any potential jurors be removed for cause if there was the slightest doubt that they could obey the judge's instructions to put aside their biases, any biases that they might have. There's no indication what the politics were of these jurors. And keep in mind, even if you're looking at the fact that Manhattan, New York City, is predominantly a Democratic city, it also has a significant number of Republicans and pro-Trump people. All 12 of these jurors, however, agreed, and apparently agreed faster than I and many others thought, that Trump is guilty. The reason that Donald Trump was convicted is not that Manhattan is a Democrat-leaning city, but because the evidence was sufficient to convince any reasonable juror, Republican or Democrat, that he's guilty.
Let's speak to Bob Weiner, who is former White House Director of Public Affairs and Chief of Press Relations during the Clinton and Bush administrations, a close friend of Joe Biden. What do you think Joe Biden should say in response to this, Bob? He's already being accused of weaponizing the justice system, even though some Democrats think he has been too standoffish, as has his Attorney General Merrick Garland. They want them to get deep down and dirty, just as they think Trump does. How do you think he should respond?
Well, I think we have to take this verdict. It's Henry, right? That's what I'm talking to.
Yes, it's Henry. Yes. Thank you. You're on Times
Hi, how
Radio.
are you? Good to be.
I'm in great form. This is a very big story here too.
Oh, it's an outrageously big story. This is a 34-count felony. Every newspaper in America tomorrow, every single one will say Trump guilty, 34 felony counts. And the polling has shown, despite the babble of that lady before who said that 2/3 of America, this and that, the polling has shown that the solid middle, the 7 to 13%, we're going to be moving away from Biden toward Trump if acquitted, but toward Biden and away from Trump, 7 to 13% if he was found guilty. And my guess was there was going to be a compromise, like the 9 that Trump signed, actually the checks. All 34. This is a real message. And as a lady in church told my wife, it's become time to pay the piper. So this is a real signal. And don't forget. Do not forget that every election since 2016, except for that one. Every election, Trump has underperformed. Every single one, every off-year election, every congressional, every Senate election, and the presidential election. Trump has underperformed because the view in America is not Trump, and this solidifies it dramatically. And if I were the Republican Party, I'd look at that. I guess it's too late for them to change nominees, but they are crazy to have Trump as the nominee, not only with this set of verdicts, but with all the other trials pending that their little puppet, Eileen Cannon in Florida, but the other two judges are actually on the case, are actually moving toward trials there. And some could happen and start before the election.
What about that point I made a short time ago, Bob? And I'll remind people that last week, I think it was an Ipsos poll came out showing that 2/3 of Americans were worried that their country was edging towards an outburst of political violence, particularly linked to the trials and tribulations of Donald Trump. Doesn't this cement that division even further, do you not think?
Well, I went to the New York trials. I happened to be in New York by accident the first day of the Bragg trials, and I went to the courthouse, and I was there in front, and it was 7 Trump protesters and 3,000 media. And I made the point to the media as I was talking to them, because I had a media tag on, and so I was able to run around, that the story here is the not Trump support. There isn't any. And so there's the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys. They're the nuts. They're the nuts, Henry. But the bulk of the American people, no, we're not going to violence. We're going to elect Biden, and he's going to be overwhelming. And I believe that Jim Clyburn, who's a close friend of mine, for years we were in the Young Democrats together and then on the board of the National Democratic Party together and so forth, that he is right, that 7 million margin could turn into 15 million in this election because of the fact of who Trump is, how he projects. Everybody recognizes that he projects everything he claims that the other side is doing. He's just looking in a mirror and saying it's him. And so everything about Trump is disgraceful, disgusting, autocratic. Some people use the word fascist, dictator, all of that.
You say all this, Bob, but there's a core of Americans.
Everything about it.
You say all this, but there's a core of Americans who, when they see him, they see the America that they love or loved, and they want to return to it, make America great again. And no matter what he does, they think, this is our guy. They're unshakable.
Well, they used to think that they agreed with him that he could shoot anybody on Fifth Avenue and get away with it. Guess what? He just didn't get away with it, and that's in New York. So I don't agree with that. I think there's a core. I think it's smaller than what you're talking about. I think people will be, when they realize a jury unanimously, despite all the talk that there was a Trump person on it, he was winking, he was laughing, he was all of that there was going to be a holdout and they'd have to do the compromise that even I thought maybe they'd have to do. A unanimous verdict. And when they started asking, they wanted the judge's instructions, they wanted David Pecker's testimony, they wanted Michael Cohen's testimony. They were moving toward the facts of what drove this case. And the American people, as I said, the media follows a real story. The real story here, there is no other story. The real story is Trump convicted on 34 felonies. And that will be the discussion. It will be the news. It will be the lead. They'll have a little bit of babble of the Trump opposition. Sure, witch hunt and rigged and blah, blah, blah. But what the real story is 34 felony counts on election interference, because that was the tie that made them a felony. It wasn't just paying hush money, which is disgusting enough as it is, by the way.
Well, you're saying that in bold, Bob, and it's they're in bold on the second editions of more and more of our newspapers that are going to be hitting the streets in the morning. Bob Weiner, former White House Director of Public Affairs, thank you very much indeed for joining us on Times Radio. He was Chief of Press Relations during the Clinton and Bush administrations. He's close to Joe Biden. Okay, well, let's talk to Reed Galen, co-founder of the Lincoln Project, an anti-Trump enterprise, and a former strategist for George W. Bush, John McCain, and Arnold Schwarzenegger. Reed, hello to you.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Now, it's really good to talk to you, especially tonight. And the way this is being framed is really, really interesting. Either further evidence that this is lawfare, the system is rigged, it's about Joe Biden trying to give himself an advantage in the forthcoming November election, or it's what the system working properly, without fear or favor. How do you see it? Let me guess.
Yeah, I think, some fear, not much favor. But, in old Republican times, when I was still part of the party, we had this expression that character counts, that it really did matter who you were, not only externally about what you said, but also how you act. And this is the culmination of nearly 80 years. Think about that. Donald Trump's almost 80. nearly 80 years of bad behavior, most of which has taken place in the city of New York on the island of Manhattan. And 12 of his peers from that borough decided he was guilty today.
But 12 of his peers in a strongly Democrat leaning city and state. And as a result of that, a lot of the people in middle America, down in the Bible Belt, will say this is evidence that our guy is being shut out, and they won't change their behavior. They won't change their voting intention. How would you respond to that?
Well, they're not. They weren't going to change their voting behavior anyway. So they can be as fired up and as upset as they want. His core, as your last guest said, his core supporters are ride or die with him. I would venture to say, though, that most Americans have not really paid attention to the trial. Here it is. In the United States, we're about to get out of school. We just had our Memorial Day holiday, which is our unofficial beginning of summer. And so, as I read local newspapers and local news in states like Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania that are going to matter, most of it has not had anything to do with Donald Trump or his trial. If it's been at all on the front page, I think tomorrow would be the first time people pick up their newspapers or open their browsers and see in big, bold font, Donald Trump convicted on all counts. And I think it's far too early to say what electoral effect it will have. But I'll tell you this, I'd rather not be Donald Trump and his campaign today.
What do you think Republicans, the people that you used to see as your political kith and kin, should do? How should they respond to this? The ones who haven't been captured by the Trump train.
The first thing I think they should do is not get on that train at all. Nowhere between now and November 5th. They should, if they want to vote, they should vote and leave President blank. But if they can, in good conscience, vote for a Democrat once or one more time, if they voted for Joe Biden in 2020, they should vote for him again. They do not owe this man or this party their vote or their loyalty anymore. I've been gone for 8 years now, right? This is not the party I grew up in. It's not the party I worked in. And I will tell you that there are a lot of Republicans, maybe they voted for Nikki Haley. I know she said she's going to vote for Trump, who said they didn't want much more to do with this. And I think this is one more example of a lot of Americans, either Republicans or maybe conservative leaning independents, who might be saying to themselves, just enough is enough. I just can't deal with any of this anymore.
But even if the figurehead is neutered, even if he is muted, hasn't he laid the groundwork for something that's going to survive him? Something deeply polarizing, quite extreme, and that feels it's lost its country. You might have heard, I don't know, Jan Halper Hayes, a former advisor to President Trump. We spoke to her about 10, 15 minutes ago, and she was talking about the invasion from the southern border, or the rape, the crimes done by illegal aliens. They're losing their country, and Trump is the guy who can bring it back. And an awful lot of Americans still feel that way.
I mean, I would say this is that I think that we do have a situation at the southern border with Mexico that needs to be addressed. The rest of that stuff you just talked about is hogwash. Crime is down across the United States, including in big cities, no matter what Trump advisors or Fox News here in the United States says. So that's just poppycock. The next piece is that, you're right, that in a lot of what we would call the old Confederacy, the southern United States, Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Arkansas, Kentucky, yet MAGA has soaked in. It has definitely soaked in. And so, yes, when Trump goes, MAGA won't necessarily go with him completely. But I'll tell you this, once the head of the movement is defeated and defeated soundly, there will be a lot of other people on the Republican side of the aisle who will want their chance, and they'll want Donald Trump to go.
Reed Galen, co-founder of the Lincoln Project, thank you very much indeed for joining us on Times Radio. Lots of people sending in their texts. Ken, in reference to an earlier conversation, this guy knows what he's talking about. Clinton got away with everything. Thank you very much. And then Dominic and Whitby, isn't it pretty to think we might be measured, balanced, fair and rational in our discussion of Trump, and he would listen and respond in kind, meeting our comments with a balanced, fair and rational reply. Oops, I just saw a flying pig. Thank you very much. And Elizabeth, thank you very much for your lovely text.